Hello, everyone, and welcome. As you're coming into the waiting room, coming into the webinar room, we just want you to know that we're so excited that you're choosing to invest an hour of your day with us on this very important topic. And we want the chat to be a lively place for you to share your input and perspectives today. So if you could take a quick moment and let us know in the chat where you're calling in from today. What we'd love you to do is to use the drop-down menu to select everyone so that everyone who's in the room can see our comments. And if you're attending today as part of your professional development, we would love to give a shout out to your organization. Please feel free to let us know what organization you're representing, and I'll try my best to shout out as many as possible. But welcome to Aaron in Kaysville, Utah, in St. Petersburg, Florida, Indianapolis, Indiana. My friend Rose is on the call. Aaron is with JUB Engineers, Inc. Looks like we've got Virginia, Oregon, Texas, Wisconsin, Ultra Camp in Niles, Michigan. We've got some Canadian callers. Thank you so much to all of you who are choosing to share your locations with us. Looks like we have a caller in India. We have someone joining from Tampa Bay, Florida at Arbitration Forums. Bloomfield, New Jersey. That's where my mother is from with Dewberry. We've got UW-Madison Division of Extension, Wisconsin. So hello to all of you who are joining. We are so thrilled, as I said, to be with you and friends, Gena, Minette, Sarah. What a great day it is to be with you. Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
Good to
hello.
be here. Yeah.
So before we get any further, I want to let you know a few housekeeping items for today's event. You might see behind me, I have the 3 books from these 3 amazing authors. We have Minette Norman, the author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader. We have Gena Cox, the author of Leading Inclusion. And we have Sara Taylor. Her book is the newest to have launched, Thinking at the Speed of Bias. I have the 3 beautiful books behind me. And you might be here today because you are hoping that you will win one of 20 boxes of books that we will be sending out after this event to a random drawing of folks. So hopefully you will be one of the winners of the book boxes today. And we will have a recording of this conversation available later in the event that you find value and you want to share it with your colleagues. And we'll be sending out some follow-up materials and that recording for you so that you can listen again. I just know that this is going to be a tremendously amazing conversation, and I can't wait to get started. However, before we go any further, I want to share a little bit more about today's guests, and I'm going to start with my friend, Sara Taylor. So Sara Taylor has been doing this important work for over 3 decades, helping organizations and the individuals within them to be more effective and inclusive through her engaging diversity and inclusion trainings, her comprehensive leadership development programs, and her innovative cultural competence frameworks. Sara is the president of Deep Sea Consulting and the author of this new book, Thinking at the Speed of Bias, and her first book, which is called Filter Shifts. So Sara, I hope I got it all. I'm sure I didn't get it all. There's so much more I could say about you.
You definitely got enough. Thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate it.
Oh,
And
my
glad to
pleasure.
be here.
It is great to have you. I'd also love to introduce Minette Norman. Minette is an award-winning speaker and leadership consultant, and she spent decades in the tech industry leading global teams. And one thing I love about Minette is the way that she's brought those experiences that she had working in tech into this book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, in ways that are so relatable and so authentic. Minette has been doing tons of speaking since her 2 books launched last year. Her other book is co-authored with Caroline Helbig. It's called The Psychological Safety Playbook. So Minette, I'm so thrilled to have you here with us today.
And I'm thrilled to be here with you. Thank you so much, Becky, and great to be here with Gena and Sara.
So I have a question quickly that I want to answer from Aaron. So we are on the Zoom webinar platform, which means that all of you who are with us today are behind a webinar wall. We cannot see you, we cannot hear you. And so if you're busy in your work environment, you can go ahead and just enjoy this conversation without any worry that your noise will interfere with our event. So all good on that. We will later in today's session, though, be taking your Q&A in the chat. So if at any point during the conversation you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will come back to them partway through once we've had some great conversation with the authors. So finally, I'm so thrilled to introduce Dr. Gena Cox. And Gena has nuanced insights in a straightforward yet relatable style. And she is an organizational psychologist, an executive coach, and a speaker. And she blends her real world insights to help leaders enhance their influence and impact. So Gena is the author of Leading Inclusion, as I mentioned, and she is a prominent voice in human-centered leadership. She believes that diversity and inclusion are nothing more than effective leadership and healthy workplace culture, which I believe all of my colleagues on the call today have that perspective about how important individual humans are. Wow, Gena has a ton of different credentials. I'm not going to read them all, but we did put the full bios into the chat. So we have some unique experiences and perspectives to bring to this call. And we also want to hear from all of you as we get started today. So I do have a poll. We would love to hear about you. We would love to know from you. What is the biggest challenge in your organization or that your organization faces in its efforts to build a diverse and inclusive workforce? So is the challenge leadership, vision, commitment, focusing on the wrong things, employee resistance, lack of accountability, unsure where to start, or something else? And if you select something else, we would love to see that something else as a note in the chat. So I'm going to give you a few moments to respond to the poll, and then I will share those results. So we'll be with you in just a moment. While you're answering the poll, I do want to give a shout out to my colleague, Wendy Hahn. You do not see her on camera, but she is the one responsible behind the scenes for ensuring that this event goes smoothly. So thank you to Wendy. Looks like one of the something else's is toxic environments. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds because people are still answering the poll. So thank you for your input. So before I show the results, I'm curious, and I'll ask you first, Gena, what do you think we're going to see on this poll?
I suspect it will be a lot about the environment. And if you're thinking about this from the perspective of, let's say, an HR leader, you might say, employee resistance, because there's such a, wide range of opinions on the topic.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and show the results. And thanks to those of you who are commenting. It looks like this is a topic that's generating a lot of insights and emotions from our attendees. Okay, so 26% of you said that leadership, vision, or commitment is the biggest challenge in your organization. 17% of you said focusing on the wrong things, 19% employee resistance, 26% lack of accountability, 28% unsure where to start, and 19% something else. And we're getting some great answers in the chat about what that something else is. So as we get started today, I would love to start with this question so that those who are attending can get some perspectives into how we show up to the conversation today. So I want to ask you each, what is the unique perspective that you bring to this conversation and topic? Gena, if you'd like to share first.
Yeah, my perspective on this topic is that we all care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, regardless of what we look like, regardless of our job titles, and so on. And my perspective on this comes from, being someone who was born outside of the United States and came here when I was 20 years old, and realized that people were reacting to me in a way that was different than the way in which I had been received in my previous 20 years. And as I try to understand what that was about, eventually I landed upon the fact that, showing up as a Black woman does bring with it a particular experience that people don't even realize you're having. And so apart from being, an organizational psychologist who has studied human behavior for decades and worked in global organizations and thought about these things deeply, I also bring the perspective of someone who feels the experience, who has deeply felt and still does sometimes feel that experience of exclusion that is so profound that it influences everything that you do if you let it. And I think together my perspective as an immigrant, as a mother, as an organizational psychologist, and as a Black woman gives me a perspective that is helpful, I think, for some other people to hear.
Thank you, Gena. Minette, would you like to share?
Sure. Yeah, it's so interesting how we each bring our own lenses and our own perspectives, and I love that. I think that's part of what we have to embrace when we think about inclusion. I think my perspective, my unique perspective, I think comes from my 30 years of experience in the tech industry. And as I took on leadership roles, I spent about 20 of those years leading teams. And it was so interesting not only to be a leader, but to be a member of a team and feeling at different points in my career being sort of in the power seat and feeling included, and also then feeling like I am not in the insiders group and I am an outsider and I'm feeling excluded. And even, with the privilege of being a white woman in a VP position, I often felt like I am just not part of this insiders group. And I was trying at the same time to help my team members all feel included. So I felt like I had this dual role of being a leader, trying to create an environment that was inclusive to all, while at the same time, I was feeling marginalized from my own leadership team that I was a part of. And I bring that perspective into all of my work because I think so many of us feel like outsiders and feel marginalized for so many different reasons. And race and gender are just the tip of the iceberg. So there's so many reasons we feel othered.
Mhm.
Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, first of all, I have been a DEI practitioner for 35 years, but working both inside organizations and outside organizations as a consultant. And so I've had seen this work in so many organizations. But I think the other piece for me, and I see Angela here from Wisconsin Extension. Sorry, that just said that with a real Minnesota, Wisconsin. She's from Wisconsin. So Angela, shout out to Extension. Extension was one of my first roles in DEI, and I very much come from the Extension approach that became very ingrained in me, and that is taking research-based information and making it applicable and practical. And so much of my work is that everything research-based, but yet how do we make it real? And how do we actually make it practical for folks to actually make change, to actually develop? And then on the personal side, I have a biracial, bicultural family. And so on a daily basis, it witnessing those differences and a part of those differences, and obviously bring that to my work as well.
Amazing. Well, we were talking before the call started just about how some differences are very obvious and other differences are not. So I'm just going to pause for a moment to say happy National Left-Handers Day to any on the call who might be left-handed. I happen to be a person who's different on this call. I am the only left-handed person on camera at the moment. If you're left-handed, give me a shout in the chat. It's interesting when we think about inclusion, how there are some differences that are invisible and other differences that are visible. And there are also some differences that might carry some kind of judgment or difficult feeling about. And then there are others that, I hope in today's society that there aren't any judgments about the difference of being left-handed but at any rate, that's just a small example of the seen and unseen differences that we bring. So I'm curious, as we think about wanting to create workplaces that are inclusive of everyone, what are the most helpful ways that leaders can take action to fuel the inclusion that we all want to see in our worlds? And Minette, would you share first?
Sure. So this is a big question, obviously, and it's such a big question because leaders really set the tone for their organizations and their teams, and it's in what they pay attention to, what they reward, what they tolerate, what they communicate, what they stay silent about. All of these ways leaders show up are going to either promote and foster inclusion or maybe inadvertently exclude others. And so I always like to say we must, as leaders, start with ourselves and our own behavior before we can really make systemic changes in an organization. So leaders have to pay attention to how are they listening to the members of their team? Because if they're not conscious of this, what they'll do is they will pay attention and listen and agree to the people who are most like them. That's our affinity bias. We're drawn to people like us. And they may, ignore or even embarrass people who disagree with them. So we have to really listen with an open mind. And we as leaders have to create conditions where everyone has a voice and each voice is welcome and respected. And so I start with really basic things like, how do we run our meetings? How do we make sure everyone can fully participate, even if they don't feel like they're maybe part of that inside group and they may not feel comfortable speaking up? Can we offer other ways for them to give their input? And then, I could go on forever, but I won't, because I think there's so much to discuss here. But I'll just come back to this. Leaders must be very, very self-aware of how are they showing up and what are they paying attention to in their teams, and are they really creating conditions for everyone to share those wild ideas that we need.
Thank you. Sara, what would you add?
Yeah, I'm gonna, just like I said in my introduction, I rely on research and make it practical. I'm gonna start with some research from the International Management Development Institute. They looked at both diverse and homogeneous teams, and then they measured their performance. And what they found were three groupings of teams. Lowest performing teams, surprisingly, were diverse teams. Mediocre, big chunk of teams in the middle were homogeneous teams, but diverse teams were also the peak performers. So what's the difference? What makes diverse teams both the lowest performing and the highest performing? What they found was it was their ability specifically of cultural competence, ability to interact effectively with the differences on their team, to check and challenge their unconscious bias and be their most effective selves. So we know that in that research also that not only was performance higher because of this ability, but inclusion was higher, engagement was higher, equity was higher. But the leading indicator of all of those was this ability of cultural competence. And so, just like Minette said, leaders need to start with themselves first. Because what we have seen in organization after organization, we have yet to see an organization whose, as an organization, they are more competent than their leaders when it comes to cultural competence. Not because leaders are somehow, better, more special, but because of that. I love the quote, Frederick. They create the weather. They set the bar of the organizational culture. And so leaders have to start with themselves. This is not work that can be delegated. They've got to start with themselves, and then they've got to be able to sustain it and support it in the organization. And that includes funding, that includes their time, that includes their regular championing of the work.
Thank you, Sara. Gena, what would you add? And I think you said something in the pre-webinar call that I hope you'll repeat here.
Yeah, and it's of course related to everything that has been said. But the question you asked was, what are the most useful ways leaders can take action to fuel inclusion? And what I said in the pre-call was that, if leaders don't behave inclusively, no one else in the organization will, which is very much related to this comment that someone else put in the comments about leaders bring the weather. We set the tone at the top of the organization. What I would add then is that leaders have to be really overt about this inclusion thing. Inclusion is not something that employees in an organization should have to infer. In other words, if I come to work, regardless of what I look like, left-handed or right-handed, if I come into an organization, shouldn't have to wonder, is this an organization that is led by someone who is inclusive or not inclusive? It ought to be very clear. And the reason it needs to be very clear is that, we can talk about all of the things that, we can talk about a variety of things on this topic, but the reality is that inclusion and the leader's actions directly impact, outcomes such as employee retention, burnout, turnover, and job satisfaction and engagement and so on. And so to the extent that I believe that I'm working in an organization where the leader at the top is setting this tone of inclusion, the odds are that I will be my performance will be stronger regardless of what I look like. But the other reason why you got to make it overt is that, we have these broad conversations about what inclusion feels like, but the reality is that people worry about what the experience is going to be, or what is their day-to-day experience going to be when if they have even a whiff that the leader is not inclusive, right? And so all employees want to have a leader who's a designated hitter. They want a person who is that one person who has their back. And so the idea that a leader might not be inclusive is completely contradictory to the notion of effective leadership if you look at it from an employee perspective.
Well, of course. And I love that anyone coming to work needs to know that the leader has their back, that the leader's on their side. How powerful is that?
Yeah, I would just continue to add to that because we also know that folks are looking for this more. We see across industries that folks are saying, I'm going to pick where I work based on how inclusive it is, based on how diverse it is, based on how committed leadership is. And you're not going to know that if they aren't being overt.
Mm. Yeah, I wonder
You
what
know,
some of the signs are. Like, what might a leader say or do from the time they hire someone that would help that person know that this is an inclusive environment?
Well, I know as a candidate, there's a story that I often relate that is something that happened to me 20 years ago that I have never forgotten. That when I applied for a job at a large international media company, and I remember interviewing in New York and then going to California and doing all this stuff, and feeling very cool, like, oh my gosh, this big name is interviewing me. And then I never heard another word from them. Now, of course, that means I never got the job, but more than that, it meant I never understood what it was that was missing in myself as a candidate. I never got any support in terms of, well, how could I be better as a potential candidate? And more importantly, I wondered, well, what kind of an organization is it that would drag me all over the country, sit down with me for hours, and then just turn their back on me as if I never existed? So this whole idea of what do organizations do that offer the clues as to whether the organization is likely to be inclusive or not starts before a person even applies for a job, definitely continues throughout the whole journey. And then as an employee, one of the most common clues I think nowadays as that causes people to sometimes wonder is when employees feel like they don't, and Minette will surely talk about this, but when employees don't feel like they have the opportunity to share their ideas and to just express whatever it is that they want to say. And so when I was working in a large company that was acquiring another company, and I was walking by the mailroom, and I heard a party. It sounded like a party, and I said, "Well, what's going on in here?" And people said to me, "Well, you know what? These people are sending all of these packages back, and they're going through the due diligence phase in this acquisition, and we're sending all these packages back and forth between Michigan and this other state. Why don't we just compile them into a morning and an afternoon mailing in one location, and a morning and an afternoon mailing in the other, and then send them? Because what's happening is we're losing a lot of these letters. People are calling us to ask us, where are they? We have no way of tracking this. This is all pre-internet." And I said, well, why wouldn't you tell the leaders of the organization that we have this great idea? And they say, when we give our ideas, no one listens. That's another clear sign that an organization is not inclusive.
Yeah, and I want to go back to your original question, Becky, about like how could someone signal it's an inclusive environment? I think you can say all you want, and I think you should. I think if you're interviewing someone, one of the ways you can signal that this is truly inclusive is to actually say, we do not expect conformity. We argue, we have debate, we like dissent, to actually express that. But people will not believe it until they witness it. And so that's why it is so important that you have the reputation. People talk, the internet is powerful. If this is an inclusive organization because of its reputation. So you can say all you want, but employees really need to have proof that, oh yeah, you say you want lack of, you don't care about inconformity. Well, I have a completely different idea. Can I really share it without being marginalized, embarrassed, ignored? That will be the proof that this is an inclusive environment.
So for those of you who are with us on the call, if you have some things that you've witnessed in your organizations from your leaders that have signaled to you that you're working in an inclusive environment, or the opposite, feel free to go ahead and put those examples in the chat. We'll take a look at them as well. So Sarah, let's look at the next question of how teams can work together to increase inclusion.
I'm going to start real big picture and then give a real specific. Obviously, based on some of the things I've earlier said, that number one is develop the ability. So often we say, okay, we want to be an inclusive organization. Just go, be inclusive. Just go, do that. And we don't actually develop the skills that folks need to be inclusive. And so that is number one. It's not something that you can pick up from a drive-through window. You have to do the development work and actually develop those skills. But in addition, because that is a little bit more longer, what can folks start doing right now? One of the things that we encourage folks to do is use what we call personal guidebooks. So where everyone on the team and their set of real specific questions, things like, what makes me tick? What makes me my best at work? What triggers me? What stresses me? How do I like to communicate? How do I work on timelines? All kinds of things that just let us know more deeply about each individual. And then you learn that. You really study those guidebooks essentially of your colleagues. And okay, well, my colleague's not going to like it if I give this to them last minute. So, I'm going to do something else. Whatever the case might be, that you learn that and you respond differently for them then. So it is really making that much more intentional and something that's just a part of your daily. The other piece that we know from a study that took a look at teams and said, okay, we're going to ask them to do a task, and with the group that they were actually researching, they said, okay, at the end, we're going to really ask you how well you did from that inclusion perspective. And that team, you can imagine, did better just because they were prompted and because they were told that at the end of this project or this process, we're going to have you self-evaluate. So it was top of mind and folks were thinking about it more. So those are two very tangible things that folks can take and use right away today.
I love that. So you're saying one of the ways we can be more inclusive on our teams is to know each other.
Absolutely. Because it's little things like I like small talk and my colleague doesn't, but I don't know that. And so I come to the meeting and I'm doing all kinds of chit chat and I want to know about their weekend. And they're thinking, what the heck are you doing asking me about my weekend? So if I don't know that about them, I don't even realize that I'm not creating a welcoming and inclusive space for them.
Nice. Gena, what would you add?
So I certainly agree with everything that Sara said, as I always do, because I think her work is fabulous, as is Minette's. I have been thinking about this issue for a very long time, and I did some research in preparation for the publication of my book that came out in 2022. And what I really was trying to understand is, well, what exactly could I share with my clients that would be sort of practical, that they could actually do it and could keep it in mind? Because we all agree that this inclusion thing is a big deal. It's something you kind of have to think about. And I sort of live this way every day, but not everybody lives with this, going around in their heads every day. Eventually, though, when I did that research in the summer of 2020, one of the things that I discovered was that, especially for people from underrepresented groups, the number one thing that they really look for when you ask them about inclusion is respect. So you hear me talking a lot about this word respect, and it's an old-fashioned word. I didn't coin it. We've all known what it is. But what I discovered was that most people don't realize how important respect is as an outcome that all humans seek, and in particular, people from underrepresented groups who, according to the research, are seen as not the prototypical employee, meaning we're different. Because we're different, we perceive that we are not treated with respect as much as other people. And so we crave it more. And there's a whole cycle of wanting respect, not getting respect, and then craving it even more that tends to play out. And so you'll hear me say that one thing that any person on any team can do is to make sure that every person with whom they interact, whether an employee, a colleague, a business partner, or whomever, that they feel seen, heard, and valued. The three things are non-negotiable. If I don't feel seen, as in literally, I believe that, you're acknowledging my humanity as a person. If I don't feel that, well, I don't feel respected. If I don't feel heard, which is to say, having that space for my ideas and for me to believe that you're hearing what I have to say and that there's some reciprocity in the interaction, I don't feel respected. If I don't feel valued, which is to say, my actions, my contributions, my ideas are recognized and rewarded, I don't feel respected. And in organizations, in a team, I have to feel all three of those things, according to my work, in order to be able to say I feel respected. It's a very big deal. But if I break it down into those three things, hopefully you'll remember to think at least about one of them on the journey to what I call the ease that we all seek in our interpersonal interactions at work.
Thank you, Gena. That's a really powerful reminder to be able to think through of our people being seen, heard, and valued. Minette, I know you have a lot of experience with teams, so I'm curious to hear your input on this.
Yeah, and really building on what Gena just said, it's funny, there's a quote in my book, and I think it's almost exactly those words where I say, we can't underestimate the need for human beings to be heard, seen, and respected. And before I talk specifically about practicalities, I just want to share one data point that I think is so interesting, is that when we are excluded, when we feel excluded, when we feel that we are not respected, our brains register pain. This is something the neuroscientists have studied, and that our brains light up with pain when we are excluded in exactly the same way we register physical pain. And it's one of those things I share often when I'm speaking, especially to very scientific or technical groups, is like, this is real. This is neuroscience. This is not like you're being overly sensitive, Minette or Gena or Sara. This is your brain registering that a human need is for us to be included in groups. And that's how we have evolved as a species. So I think we have to ground ourselves in that when we're talking about inclusion. And then when we talk about group behavior, there's also another really interesting study I read, which is that homogeneous groups find it much more easy to work together. Of course, that's obvious. And diverse groups struggle more. And so we have to be very deliberate. We create, we go to the trouble of hiring a diverse workforce. Now, how do we get us all to work together? And, I love, Sara, your idea about the guidebooks. I think that all of the ways we get to know each other as fellow human beings will enable us to work better together. And so the guidebooks, I like, there's a great exercise you can do where, especially getting a new team together, or if you're just trying to re-gel as a team, where everyone shares what their superpowers are. So now okay, Gena is so good at this one thing and I'm not, so I can turn to her when I need help with that. And we become a stronger team because we now know everyone's superpowers. And then we may also know what we each may need some help with. And that is, that little bit of vulnerability. I remember the first time I said to my own staff members, I am really bad with presenting data. I'm going to need some help with that. And people were just like, I can do that. I'm good at that. And suddenly we gel as a team because we tap into one another's strengths and we fill in for our gaps. And that's what a diverse team can do, is that we can each complement one another. But the foundation for that is feeling like I can speak up. This is a safe environment. And that's why I believe that psychological safety is the foundation for inclusion, because if you can't share that idea, if you can't ask for help, if you can't say I'm struggling with something, then you're not going to feel like you can get to that next level of feeling I'm fully included and respected in this group. And that's why I think really basic things like, how do we listen to one another? How do we respond to challenges and dissent in a group and not shame anyone? All of these small behaviors will contribute to the safety and therefore the inclusion and this feeling of like, I belong here, I'm respected for who I am, and I don't have to act like Sara or like Gena or like Becky. I can show up as myself and still be fully respected and appreciated.
Wow, so much to think about and so much that we can implement. And what I'm wondering about, because this does seem like, for organizations and leaders or even individual contributors who want to embark on working in their organizations to create more inclusion, it's a lot of effort. And what are the outcomes that we can expect if we invest our time in including others more? So I'd love for us to talk for a few minutes about what the benefits are to organizations who embark on this work and undergo this transformation. And let's see, I know I'm alphabetical order. Who is supposed to go first this time? I totally lost it. I think it's Gena who's supposed to go first this time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. So yeah, I mean, I guess what we're really saying is that we have these ideas, these things that we believe. Part of the reason we believe these things so strongly is we have seen that there have been benefits that come from these ideas, these actions that we call inclusion. Although we could call them a variety of other things, I don't think that we need to spend all of our energies worrying about some of this terminology. By the way, this is a little bit of me on the soapbox, because I think sometimes it gets in the way. The reality is that for the kinds of work that I've been talking about, for example, where I'm trying to help organizations or have tried to help organizations think about introducing ideas such as respect as core corporate values that can be supported by the board, supported by the C-suite, and articulated and operationalized in a way that every employee can see that this is a way to be. When I think about respect as a precursor for inclusion, I'm thinking about it as a way to be. It's not a word, it's not an abstraction. This is just how we're going to operate on a day-to-day basis with everything that we do. And there's someone on this call, I think she's still on, where we recently talked about this very thing when we were sitting together in a restaurant and the waitress started to sweep under our feet. And neither of us said anything because we understood that there was a reason this person was doing this, because they thought this is what they needed to do to get their job done. But we also, as patrons of this restaurant, were feeling very disrespected, and we talk a little bit about that. But for example, when I worked with a hospital system recently, one of the things that they were solving for was that they had a very high turnover rate of approximately 25% amongst their registered nurses. 25% turnover in any role is a dramatic cost to an organization. But when you're talking about trained nurses at a very high pay rate, this is, and of course, the services that the clients, the services that the patients need from these nurses not being available to be delivered, it's a significant cost to an organization and also a significant impact on patient experience. One of the things, though, that we discovered through employee surveys, including of the nurses, was that the nurses were leaving because they felt very disrespected. And by whom did they feel disrespected? It was really fascinating. They felt disrespected by the physicians with whom they worked, and they felt disrespected by the patients with whom they worked. It was as if they were in a globe of disrespect. So once, they reached out to me, and we what we actually did was work on a variety of interventions to really define what good behavior in effect looked like. What culture did this nursing organization want its nurses to experience, and then by extension its patients. And of course, we then also did something separate for physicians, because physicians and nurses, though part of a team, they don't necessarily speak the same language, and there's a big power imbalance between the two. But the bottom line was, after there was actually about 18 to 24 months that we measured, where we could see that after introducing these actions that basically just simply changed the way doctors interacted with nurses interacted with doctors, and then the two interacted with their patients, the significant reduction in turnover from 25% to 18%. Now, 18% might not sound very impressive unless you knew that on a national level, this is an ongoing problem that all hospital systems are facing, and 18% turns out to be not that bad.
What a great illustration of this. Minette, would you have anything to share about what benefits organizations can experience when they undergo this work?
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many that, that are documented, whether it's performance, turnover. What I think one I'll focus on is innovation, because I've seen time and time again that when you create a more inclusive and safe culture, then those wild ideas can emerge. And, it can be very vulnerable to bring up an idea that is so different from anything anyone's done before. So I was working with an organization that had been fairly stagnant. They were not doing so well. And when they started to really change, and it was basic things like, how do we run meetings? How do we get ideas from people? And when, some of the people who had never shared their ideas before and started to speak up, because there were new ways, like you could contribute through an online whiteboard if you didn't want to speak in a meeting, or there were other ways to share ideas. What emerged were some of the most innovative ideas from people that you had never heard from before. And one of those ideas completely transformed the workflow of how they work together. Their bottom line improved, employee engagement improved, and they were now seen, instead of this stagnant team, as they were like an industry innovator. So that's what's possible when you can create the conditions where everyone can fully participate. So I think innovation is one of the things we must not underestimate when we think about inclusion and respect.
Amazing. Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't say too much because I know we're getting short on time, but just to underscore the retention piece, we've seen that over and over again in organizations where retention and engagement, so actual engagement scores for the organization, and then the subsequent of retention. But I wanted to also just give the flip of the behaviors that leaders need to do to get to this piece that both Gena and Minette were talking about, of being seen, heard, and respected. On the flip side, it is the leaders asking, listening, and acting. And so when leaders do that, they take the time to actually ask, and they listen, and they actually act on what they have heard. That's where we really see the uptick in the engagement and the retention. And, it's not all that hard to figure out. All we have to do, each one of us, is just think about, when were times that I felt as though I mattered, as though I was something that this organization needed and people cared that I was here. What was happening to make me feel that way? Then do that for your staff. The challenge is really just reminding ourselves to do it. That's really what it is. For folks that this doesn't come as second nature.
Thank you. That's really
Yeah,
helpful.
I love that, Sarah. Just a quick comment, and I just wanted to say, and this is again a little soapboxy, but that's okay with me, because we all know that we're in this environment where sometimes people think, I had someone ask me, is it okay to talk about inclusion in the state of Florida, where I live? And what I realized is that, people think that these ideas that we've been talking about are meant to only benefit some particular group of people, when in reality, I think what we're all agreeing and trying to get leaders to, and all employees to understand, is that the benefit of inclusion, it really it benefits everyone in an organization, because when inclusion is present, I'm more likely to be able to perform at my best. And when I'm able to perform at my best, of course, that means that I'm then the organization itself benefits from all of this effort. So far from thinking that this is something that's going to only benefit a select portion of your population, if you think about these, so the pushback against diversity, equity, and inclusion ideas, I think the pushback is really short-sighted, because it doesn't recognize the notion that anything that an organization does that improves its culture, the way the leaders behave, and the day-to-day employee experience is going to benefit the organization's bottom line.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, that brings us to our final question before we switch to a time of Q&A, and it's a question that I can't wait to hear the answer to. As we think about this topic, where are we seeing a reason for hope in our world today? What are we seeing in organizations that gives us a reason to be optimistic about more human-centered and inclusive organizations?
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, I think Minette is going to share first.
Well, I see lots of reasons for hope. And, I'm going to build on what Gena just said because it is so true that inclusion is not just benefiting those who have been traditionally marginalized. It's good for organizations in general. It's good for everybody. And I think the DEI backlash that we've been seeing, I think comes not from the majority, but from a minority. I see organizations doubling down on their DEI efforts more than pulling back. I think the ones who are pulling back never really were in the first place, and they were just dipping their toes in the water. But I see, first of all, we all have plenty of work, right? I mean, everyone I know who's doing this work still has plenty of work because organizations are investing and reinvesting and maybe reimagining. Well, maybe I wasn't doing the most important things. Now I'm going to really understand what does it mean to create an inclusive culture. And I think what organizations are starting to get is that inclusive leadership is just good leadership. It's not something strange. It's not something like maybe we'll put aside. It's just good modern leadership for the workforce today, and we all have to invest in it. So I have lots of reasons for hope. And, I'll tell you just a little short anecdote, which is that in the last year, I was invited to speak, and they did a bulk order of my book by the most improbable, I think the most improbable organization to think of being interested in inclusive leadership. And that was the leadership for the Department of Homeland Security in the US. So if they are looking at how to be more inclusive, then I have a lot of reason for hope.
Sara, why do you have hope?
Sorry, I was just trying to find my react button to do an applause for that one. That's fabulous. I absolutely love that. Um, you know, in 35 years, what gives me hope is that I look back and we have made progress. It's difficult to see sometimes, and when we feel excluded, when we see disparities, when we see inequities, it's hard to see, but we have made progress in some areas. And so that gives me hope that we can continue to make progress. I think the other thing is that we need to recognize our practice is very young as a practice. We're not as old as, say, medicine that's been around for forever. So we're learning. And every year there is more knowledge, there is more research, there are more best practice examples for us to all adopt and learn from. That is very hopeful. And again, I think I mentioned it earlier, folks are demanding this. It's not like we're sitting here and saying, yeah, you organizations ought to have this. You ought to be inclusive. No, customers are demanding it. Employees definitely are demanding it. And as our workforce ages, we see more and more of the younger generation demanding it even more. So I am hopeful for that reason as well, because the need is apparent and folks are demanding it.
Thank you, Sara. Gena.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank God for Gen Zers is what I would say in a nutshell. I am lucky enough to have lived, worked across the decades in corporate America and see things get better in general. And the force that has generally made things better is that younger people come in and say, "Why do you have such a complicated performance appraisal system with six factors and 13 dimensions? And you only ask me these questions once a year." And then this whole company redesigned their whole performance management management system to something that was one page and more regular check-ins. That was the impact of a group of people entering the workforce and saying, what the heck are you guys doing? And I think we're at one of those points with regard to Gen Z, because Gen Z, when you talk about inclusion, they're like, okay, you mean like treat me well and like care about how I feel as I'm doing this job, and don't just expect me to do the job and pay me fairly? Is that what you mean by inclusion and fairness and equity? And actually it is, because in I grew up in a generation where we kept our mouths quiet. We said the boss is the boss. We never popped our heads above the line, all that stuff. That was what I was taught. We even dressed a certain way, right? And so there's all of that groundswell of social change that is happening as a result of younger people entering the workforce, that it has made me very, very optimistic. I depend on them to tell me what I should be doing next, so that I, because they think differently and their ideas are fantastic. So there's that. There's also another thing that, as Minette alluded to it earlier, that makes me optimistic, which is that despite the rumblings that we hear in the news media amongst a small proportion of the overall population, what the research shows very clearly, and the most recent piece that I looked at was from Saramount, where they did this piece of research that they just published that said that 90% of executives and organizations believe that this DEI work matters. Again, not the acronym itself, the work of building healthy cultures, effective leaders, and positive day-to-day employee experiences for all. That's what I mean by that, right? And they said this matters so much, and they fully intend to keep on focusing on this work because it is an imperative. It is an imperative for a healthy organization, for a more effective and productive organization, and also because the demographics changes in the country suggest that that would be the only logical thing that they ought to do. But the opportunity that research also called out was that only about half of employees in organizations understood this. So leaders understand something and right now aren't very effective at articulating it to their employee workforce writ large. And so that's an opportunity, because it's going to be to bring all employees along to understand the value of inclusion in the way that executive teams understand it today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So before we get too far, I want to share a few opportunities with all of you. I mentioned at the beginning of the call that 20 of you who have been with us in person today are going to be entered to win one of 20 gift boxes. I actually looked at one this morning. It has each of the 3 authors' books. It has a surprise book, and it has some other learning collateral items in the box for you. So you don't need to do anything. You're already entered to win, and we'll get in touch with you as soon as possible after today's event to let you know that you have won one of those 20 gift boxes. We do want to encourage you to dig a little deeper and continue today's learning. And, if you don't happen to be one of the winners of the boxes, we would love you to go out and buy a copy of each of the books as soon as you know that you haven't won. If you have already read one of the books from the authors who are here today, but you haven't yet left a review on Amazon, we would encourage you to please leave a review, which will help others discover this important work. We'd love for you to connect with the authors, and we are going to make sure that you have some information from the authors, their websites, and other contact information when we send a follow-up email. I'm sure we would all love for you to follow us on LinkedIn, which I know that each of these amazing women is active and sharing content regularly on LinkedIn, so please follow or connect with them. We will have the recording from today's conversation. We would love for you to share it with your colleagues or get a group of people together and ask these questions and talk about this. If you want to do the guidebook exercise, hopefully we can point you in the direction of that, or there's so many other actionable ideas from today's call. Also, if you are looking for a speaker for your next event or on your podcast, I would highly recommend that you look at how you can include one of these women in your ongoing professional development in your organization. So just a few ways that you can continue the learning today. We have had a lot of questions. We are going to do our best to answer as many as possible, and I'm going to take these in the order in which I saw them, starting with a question from Brooke, and I'm going to go to Sara first on this. Sara, do you have any suggestions on how to strive for inclusive leadership while addressing individual performance? It's an interesting question. So, Brooke, I wasn't quite sure I understood it. I don't know, Sara, maybe you know what she wants to know.
Not sure, but the reality is inclusive leadership will boost individual performance. Just think for yourself again, back to a time when you felt you mattered. What did you do? You gave more, probably, worked harder. So if I'm misunderstanding the question, maybe Brooke, if you can restate that. But definitely individual performance for the teams increases when leaders are more inclusive.
So Brooke says, wanting people to show up as their whole selves, but what if that's not meeting the performance needs of the job role?
Honestly, this is where I go back once again to the need for cultural competence. We say so often we want folks to be their full selves, but what we really mean is, well, not quite your full self. Like maybe don't bring that part to work, bring another part to work. When organizations say that, they still don't have the capacity to fully see and appreciate the complexity of differences that we all bring. And so if that ability to be more culturally competent, the ability to check and challenge our unconscious filters and bias, if that isn't there, I'm going to be judging parts of my coworkers' selves as they bring their full self to work. And so it once again gets back to the need for doing this work intentionally and developing, giving folks those skills before you say, yep, now here we are. Now everybody bring your full selves to work, and certain aspects get shot down.
So before we move on, Sarah, there was a question directed to you about what the skills are that we need to build. If you could really just quickly bullet point
Yeah.
those skills for
Yeah,
Frederick.
it is, again, it's the skill of cultural competence and ability. There are 5 stages of ability in how effective we are in interacting across difference and creating inclusion, and checking and challenging our unconscious bias. And so as we develop along those skills, we have a greater ability to be not only more inclusive of others, but also more effective ourselves. We could certainly send some resource links to more information about cultural competence if that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Becky, may I offer a very quick comment about this?
Sure, sure.
About this question, because I love this question. I was once giving had given a talk, and someone came up to me at the end of the talk. This was just last year, and he said, I have a Black woman on my team, and I don't know how to lead her. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, basically, the story that he told me, what he really meant was, he tended to avoid her. He tended to not have as many interactions with her as he did with other people on his team. And furthermore, to Brooke's question, when she had performance inadequacies, she didn't know what the inadequacies were, and she didn't know how to make them better because he did not give her feedback. And the research from CoQual is really clear about this, that when it comes to people from underrepresented groups, they get less feedback. And so, and they're distanced. There's a great deal of social distance between them and their immediate managers. And so they don't even know how to become better. So when you're trying to talk about inclusion in the context of performance management, I think the thing that I tell leaders very simply is, you have got to be curious in order to be able to connect, and also in order to get to the level of comfort, so that every employee on your team and everybody on your team believes that you are a designated leader for them.
Thank you so much for that, Gena. So as we wrap up the hour, one of the things we want to do is just to hear quickly from each author, what's one thing those who have attended and listened to today's conversation can do today to create a more inclusive world or a more inclusive workplace. So one thing that we can do right now. And Gena, I think you're up to be first on this one.
Well, the one thing is, you got to find some way to connect with a person. You just have to, even if you got to force yourself. I would say look for the person, or think about the person, even if you work remotely, with whom you have the largest social distance. And especially if you're a manager, think about that person. You know who he or she is. And then what I want you to do is to find an opportunity to talk with that person where the conversation isn't just about the task and getting it done, where the conversation is about that person. You don't have an objective. You're just giving them some space to be. And then you got to do it more than once so that they begin to believe that you respect them and have enough trust that they can really tell you what's on their minds. It's amazing how you can build the kind of relationship that will make a huge difference over time.
Okay, so number one thing you can do, think about the person with whom you have the most social distance and find a way to connect personally. Minette, what would you add? What's
Yeah,
your
I think Gena kind of stole what I was thinking of, because it's about getting curious about the people who are least like you. So I'll add something different, which is that as a leader, I think the way you start to really change the culture is that in every group interaction, you explicitly ask for a dissenting or different viewpoint and just start to make that normal so that we can stop trying to conform and instead really appreciate our differences.
Sarah, what's your one thing?
Yeah, assume positive intent. All too often, we don't realize when we're judging others and not creating inclusion because we're judging others. And instead assuming positive intent on the part of others, especially when their behavior is very different from what I would expect. If they've got positive intent, then they've just got a different way of approaching it. And if you've got an inclusive team, that different way of approaching it should be equally as valid as other ways of approaching it.
Amazing. So you have 3 possible next steps. I hope you'll implement all 3. Take a chance today to connect with someone on your team with whom you have the biggest social distance. Connect personally. If you're in a group meeting, ask for a dissenting opinion. Make it clear that different viewpoints are welcome. And if you're in a situation where you aren't understanding someone's different behavior, assume positive intent. I hope that you'll take something away from this call. Thank you so much to everyone who has chosen to invest in spending this hour learning with us, and we look forward to more opportunities to learn with you in the future. Thank you, Dr. Gena Cox. Thank you, Minette Norman. Thank you, Sara Taylor, for being with me today.
Absolutely.
keeps
Thank
changing.
you once again for the opportunity.
Thank you all.